On FMCG. We'll soon be cutting across to the Tata Steel management, but before that, let's just look at what's happening in the markets. Markets are flat. There seems to be a negative bias in the market. Markets are at the day's lowest point. So that's broadly what you're looking at when you look at the market. Britannia on your screen, the management was just recommending, one analyst was just recommending about what they feel about Britannia. That's Nifty, 33 points down. Let's pull up the mid-cap index. That will give you a sense of the broader market space. It was strong till morning, but we've seen this. So, that's broadly what we've seen. That's Tata Steel for you, down about 1.98%. Let's go across to the management at Tata Steel. They spoke to us after their Q4 numbers.
Operationally, we could have done better, both in Europe and in India, okay? Particularly in Europe. And in Europe, we've had some struggles in the UK because our facilities there need some greater support in terms of maintenance and things like that, because the equipment is a bit old and a bit weary. IJmuiden, which is our Netherlands unit, which has typically been a top class performer, has also had a difficult year for various reasons. So I think operationally we need to operate at a better level than we did in the last year, and that will help us, because obviously if you lose volumes it impacts costs. And if you're down for maintenance and shutdowns more often than you need to, then again it adds to the cost. So I think these are factors which didn't work for us. What worked for us, the market conditions were favorable, the spreads were good. So we're looking at this year where we improve the operational performance.
So I think it's more internal problems as opposed to external, like iron ore, coking coal, etc.
Absolutely.
It's more internal.
It's more
so
internal.
I think it would be safe to say that, as these kinks, what you call, would go behind you, margins would improve.
We have to do our job.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. Even if US does impose, using of course the veil of Section 232, even if it does impose all the protection measures that it wants, there are still no concerns in relation to supply demand.
I would say that not as much concerns as we have, but I think Tata Steel, make sure we are one of the lowest cost producers of steel in the world. So irrespective of what the steel prices, we should be profitable.
Okay, fair enough. I'm going to move on from that, and I have to talk about the Bhushan Steel acquisition. You've got the green signal from the tribunals. More than enough is being said about the legal processes and the hurdles, etc., that you've faced, whether it's with the Liberty House, etc., so on and so forth. I want to talk about the numbers, because this is just, of course, based on back of the envelope calculations based on reports, but roughly the EV per ton, the valuation at which you're acquiring, comes to about $1,060. It is a bit lower than what most expected, so I guess that's a win on your part. But how would you like to compare it with your brownfield expansion, which you're doing in Kalinganagar? Would you say that it's an attractive valuation that you're being able to get a Bhushan Steel asset for?
So it's like this. I think we look at it slightly in a longer term basis. Brownfield expansions will always be cheaper than a greenfield expansion, right? But when we look at some asset like Bhushan Steel, right? Firstly, it was probably the best asset which was on sale. It's a good facility, well-built facility, very similar to the facilities we have, because the blast furnace is identical to the blast furnace we have in Jamshedpur. So we're very familiar with the facilities, and it's a ready-to-go facility. Unlike most of the other facilities which are on the block, where you needed to spend significant capital to operate at rated capacity, here you don't need to spend much capital to operate at rated capacity. Second thing is building. We know that it takes a long time to build a greenfield site. So having ready access to a site which is 5 million tons is great, because it's taken us...
And produces long products.
No, Bhushan Steel doesn't produce long products, a small amount, but Bhushan Power produces long products. So Bhushan Steel, for us to have ready access to a 5 million ton site, it's taken us almost 10 years in Kalinganagar, and we are not even at 5 million tons, right? So to me, if you look at the time value of that money, and if you look at the fact that it's 150 kilometers away from our Kalinganagar site, the pluses are more than the minuses.
So how long before you can finally go in and start,
Well, we wanted to go in tomorrow, but today the appeal has gone to NCLAT, so let's see, as we speak, things are happening, so let's see what happens in the course of day today. Otherwise, our teams are ready to move in tomorrow if we get the clearance.
Okay, so all set to essentially just go and cap. Okay, great, excellent. My concern, the other one that I do have, is in relation to the debt. You recently, of course, had the rights issue. You were able to cut down the debt significantly, at least as on March 2018. But now, of course, you're going to be shelling out about 35,000 odd crore rupees for Bhushan Steel. You also have some ICDs, so it's going to give you a good capture of the economic value in Bhushan Steel. What about debt? should investors be concerned about your debt levels elevating?
So if you saw the numbers yesterday, the net debt is about 69,000 crores
Exactly.
on an EBITDA of about 22,000 crores,
Right.
right? So that's not too bad. Of course, we want to come to 3 and go below 3 over a period of time. Obviously, the Bhushan Steel acquisition will push the numbers up a bit.
Right.
But it will also bring us EBITDA, and that's why it's important for us to get the EBITDA very quickly. The advantage of an inorganic growth is you immediately get cash, unlike organic growth where you spend money for 3-4 years and then start getting the money out of it. The other thing which is important for us to complete during this year is the Thyssen JV, because once we do that JV, about 2.5 billion euros of debt is supposed to move from the Tata Steel balance sheet to the JV balance sheet. So that will also in some sense help us. So we're very conscious of debt levels. We know what it means to operate at high debt levels. We've done it for most of the last 10 years. But I think fundamentally, if you look at it structurally, what's happening in Tata Steel is most of the debt over the last 10 years had gone into the European operation, whereas now most of the debt is going into the Indian operations, which is generally a far healthier operation, not so much just as Tata Steel as a country, because it's a growth market. And India is a great place to produce steel because there are some structural advantages of having raw materials in India and a growing market. So I think the money is being put in the right place, in the right geography, and to support the right ambitions for growth in India. So we are far more comfortable with the leverage that we have today than we had maybe 5 years back or 10 years back.
The fruit of the restructuring has clearly paid off when it comes to the pension scheme, because from having a deficit, now you have a surplus, which was of course even accounted for in your books. What I want to understand that going forward from here on, how will the pension expense, which is essentially debited to your PNL, or the contribution that you are making to the scheme, how will it change in the new BSPS versus the old BSPS?
So the new BSPS is a different structure. So firstly, about 30% of the pensioners have shifted to the PPF, which is the British fund, and 70% decided to stay on with the BSPS2, as we call it. So secondly, the BSPS is more, in some sense, limited in its potential liability than the original pension scheme, because in terms of the inflationary impact and things like that, there is a limit to how much it can grow, what is the liability. So that limits the exposure that we have. We start with 120% kind of situation, so which means we have a surplus. So it's a good position to be in, and I think it's a more limited liability kind of structure than it was in the past.